Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. The Arab Muslim world is ablaze with conflict and turmoil, be it revolution, civil wars, or external meddling. There can be no doubt this region will never be the same again. It would also appear that the old neocolonial order for much of the region is coming to an end. But what is replacing it, and who is on the right side of history? To crosstalk the Middle East in turmoil, I'm joined by Grant Smith in Washington. He is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy. And in London, we cross to Charles Wolfe. He is a writer, broadcaster, and political commentator. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Grant, if I can go to you first in Washington, we have turmoil all across the region, particularly in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Syria, Iraq. I can go on and on, Bahrain. Is this a regional civil war? Is this what we're seeing?
I think you can make an argument that even though we've got nation states, that you can make an argument that there is a conflict between two major parties that's broken out across the region. I think you see entrenched elites that don't have much representation given over those they rule. You have protesters who have been fired up, usually by some abuse, arbitrary abuse by police, affecting their meager economic life and breaking out into revolution. I think that if you define kind of a classical civil war scenario where it's a couple of entrenched groups duking it out, that you could make an argument that there is a region-wide civil war. But obviously there are some pockets that have been able to resist that, usually by hauling out the checkbook.
Okay, that was one point of view in Grant in Washington. Charlie, jump in London.
Well, I think the argument can be made either way. I don't quite see it yet at the point of civil war. It's almost like, in medical terms, I think of a heart that's fibrillating. It's not pumping effectively. Democracy or society is not operating effectively. So, as Grant said, you have a lot of different major and minor players involved. And then on the larger scale, obviously, you do have the very big players, the influence of Russia and Iran in the region, countered a bit by the influence of the United States in the region. But this is a sort of a different time that's almost hard to put a handle on. I think what's going on, for instance, in Egypt doesn't necessarily mirror what's going on in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not someone who generally believes in revolutions, even though our country, Grant and I, fought a very successful one, and out of it came a very successful state. But for the most part, a lot of revolutions don't work. So, this supposed green revolution that we saw going over the last several years, we're seeing isn't working. As the Who sang, here's to the old boss, here's to the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, but don't you think outside, Charlie, don't you think outside players are playing a big role in that? I mean, you named some, but what about Saudi Arabia and the United States supporting a coup in Egypt? I mean, that's not promoting democracy, is it, Charlie?
Well, I think the problem with some of them it's a funny one with the United States. I'll be interested to hear what our other guest has to say. I think some of the problem has been disengagement by the states. Mr. Obama has taken this sort of lead from behind situation. So you're seeing where vacuums are getting filled. For instance, Syria is a great case in point. People are saying, well, we can't arm the rebels now because al-Qaeda is involved. Well, al-Qaeda was just filling a vacuum that wasn't necessarily there a year ago. Mr. Obama held back and didn't do anything, and now we're paying the price for it. And inaction has always been a curse, whether you're talking about inaction getting into world wars or other conflicts. Once you get in at a late stage, it makes it twice as hard to find a resolution
to the situation. So, Charlie, you think that there could have been a positive outcome if there'd been an intervention? Is that what you're saying? Considering all the other failed interventions?
I'm not even necessarily saying an intervention, putting boots on the ground, but the United States took a lead from behind course, especially with Syria, and did to an extent with Libya, and I think we're now paying the price for that.
Well, Libya's doing really just great these days. Libya's doing just great. Grant, go ahead and jump in.
I think it is. I think it's not completely accurate to say that the United States has been leading from behind. We saw at the beginning, particularly of the Egyptian revolution, that the U.S. was very much interested in seeing Mubarak or his named successor continue in power. And if you look across the region, the United States would certainly be apoplectic if Qatar or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia suddenly face these same pressures. And I think, you know, behind the scenes, it's very difficult for any outside observer to know what's going on. But the fact that Obama went to Egypt, fired up students with his famous speech in Cairo, but then doesn't appear to have been doing too much. I don't think that it's accurate to say that they wouldn't have been happy with some sort of continuance of the status quo, particularly in Egypt, which is such a big recipient of funding for its deep state army, which keeps a lid on things. I think we all understand that Egypt's economic driver, one of them certainly is $10 to $15 billion from the canal, which the rest of the world considers to be absolutely critical as an economic lifeline. I mean, you're never going to see any of the major world powers look away from the Suez Canal and pretend that they aren't affected by what happens in Egypt. But just getting back to my previous point, I mean, Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar and Bahrain and Oman were all able to haul out their checkbook and deliver a little bit of what people were asking for. Ramped up the social programs. They were able to decrease unemployment. Social spending in Saudi Arabia is a half of
Grant, I think also to unleash jihadists into Syria as well. Okay. Documented.
Well, yeah, that's, I mean, yeah, obviously that's, unleash jihadists into Syria, send troops across the causeway to Bahrain. I mean, obviously their foreign and domestic policies are rather different, not so benevolent when there's a border to be crossed.
Charlie, do you want to weigh in there?
And let's
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's remember the world is not a perfect place, and the art of foreign policy is not a perfect place, and there's no necessary consistency between how you deal with one nation state versus how you deal with another. In a lot of this stuff, I remember Henry Kissinger once at a conference I was at, said, listen, he says, you have all these different countries, the cables come in from your embassies and you react to them. It's not like there's this grand master plan. You have to deal with what's on the ground. And I think, for instance, looking at Egypt, yes, I think the U.S. government, it would have been in their interest and in the interest of Israel as an ally to keep Mubarak in place. He wasn't, the greatest domestic leader, but you're right. He kept a lid on things. He kept peace treaties and kept stability in the area.
So then why does the United States, I'm sorry, Charlie, why does the United States always talk about democracy then? I mean, it's hypocrisy, isn't it?
Well, no, I don't think it is. You try and move nations where you can to democracy, but I mean, do we have democracy now under Morsi?
Morsi's gone. Morsi's gone.
Yeah, and the reason Morsi was gone was the country was going down the tubes economically. When for instance, the parking lots, as someone put it the other day, I thought summed it up best. When the parking lots outside the pyramids are empty and the tourists aren't coming, and the economy is sinking into a hole, you've got to do something. That's a reality. Morsi came in and he blew it. And that's just the end of the story. I think there's an argument to be made as far as Mubarak. I don't necessarily like to subscribe to he may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. But unfortunately, in some cases, I have to admit there's some relevance to it.
Okay, Grant, would you like to reply to that?
Well, we're basically treating Egypt as we're Panama. And, if we have our Noriega in place, kind of to hell with the Panamanians. And to a certain extent, a lot of the anger on the streets, and I think well-warranted anger, has been the United States' position, again, of funding this deep state, propping up the army, keeping the canal open for traffic, all the while Egyptians seeing kind of their political views and ability to affect policy absolutely muted. for what you just mentioned. Basically, it's better to maintain this peace agreement with Israel than to allow a messy development or experiment in self-rule from the greater mass of Egyptians. And I think I don't think that's going to be able to fly anymore. It's been surprising to hear some of the arguments for ousting Morsi as these charges of allowing a little bit of tunnel-based aid to flow into Gaza Strip and being in league with Hamas, as though that were ever a big Egyptian option or a big Egyptian problem, as if anyone actually cared about that sort of thing. So the idea of deferring and continually negating any sort of nationalist fervor in Egypt and keeping the lid on these tens of millions of people in the name of preserving a peace deal that that's been in place for so many decades, I don't think that's going to fly any longer.
Charlie, that peace deal.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I'm sorry, that peace deal is rather important because there is wider stability, and let's be honest here. Nations, be it the United States or Great Britain or Russia, etc., are acting in self-interest. They have to act in their own self-interest. that's pretty much the first rule of foreign policy.
So, Charlie, you're saying the Egyptian people don't have a right to vote on that treaty, a referendum. That's democratic.
Oh no, I'm not saying that at all. But that treaty's been in place for 30 years. It's keeping wider stability in the area. Again, you look to the problems of Syria. Let me go back to Syria. Syria's a massive problem because look what's happening to Jordan when you have refugees flowing into Jordan at this unsustainable rate. You have jihadis flowing into Syria and getting trained up that are going to then go back into home nations, such as here into the United Kingdom.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Middle East. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the Middle East in turmoil. Okay, Grant, if I can go back to you in Washington. Charlie mentioned the first part of the program that the United States is leading from behind. But, it seems to me that the United States is still trying to micromanage the entire region from country to country, looking for its clients, its new clients, and maybe in a new neocolonial environment. How do you react to that?
I think there's a certain degree of, well, yeah, absolutely. Let's just think about what precipitated, for example, a lot of the problems with Syria. We have been locking down Syria through accountability acts, through all sorts of legislation to shut down and limit diplomacy between the United States and Syria. A lot of the people in the Israel lobby here in the United States wanted to extend that to Saudi Arabia. They wanted, obviously, the Syrians out of Lebanon for reasons having a lot to do with Israel and not much to do with the United States. So I would go beyond that and say the fact that the U.S. has really defined a lot of its interests in terms of what the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and a lot of these groups that are so active on Capitol Hill want, as opposed to maximizing U.S. trade ties or trying to have more of a productive engagement with civil society, that's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And I would disagree with Charlie in saying that maintaining the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, where Israel gets a great deal and all sorts of access to military technology, building the wing of the F-35, lots of technology transfers, and basically Egypt gets a bunch of tanks to keep their population down, is not well received in the region. It's a very toxic formulation, and it might be good for the Israelis, and AIPAC might be able to trumpet it as a victory in Washington, but over the long term, and we're reaping the harvest right now, it's a disaster because it really, once the people become aware of what the dynamic is in the region through social media and as the state loses its grip on information, of course the people are going to react and they're going to want to renegotiate and have more of a say in their government, particularly in